All right, guys, it's time for another lesson. Now, I have to say, I chose this song because this song is called Ain't No Stopping Us Now. It's an old Motown favorite. Perhaps your parents might know it, but it's a perfect song for our lesson. We're going to talk about ecological succession, which we're going to be talking about how nothing can stop plants. It just keeps going and going, and they can overcome all kinds of tragedy and they can overcome whatever they're faced because plants ain't no stopping the plants. So that's why I chose that song. It was kind of it was great for this topic here. So in any case, welcome to this week's lesson. We are going to be talking about ecological succession. It's very interesting. So just as always, feel free to take notes if you so desire. However, it's not required, but you can if you'd like to. All right, so ecological succession, what is this? All right, so pretty much, guys, we're going to be talking about, we're going to describe events and processes that occur in what they call ecological succession, and how the change of populations and species, how that is a change in population and species, and how that change is reflected in diversity of the species within that ecosystem. So last week we talked about population dynamics, right? We talked about how we can number the organism within an ecosystem, how we keep track of populations, things like that. Now we're going to talk about how populations change, specifically ecological populations and species. So focus on that. We're also going to talk about how hardships of emerging species in a newly traumatized environment. So if environment is newly traumatized, how does the ecosystem come back? Like the song said, ain't no stopping us now. So how does that apply to ecological system? Their environment is traumatized, and yet that doesn't stop them. So how does an ecosystem recover from that? And then we're going to talk about something called primary and secondary succession. So first thing, ecological succession, what is it? All right, well, let's break down the word ecological. Perhaps in there you see a word that you already know. Did you find it? Like, take off this part here. Ecology, eco. If anything's talking about eco, you know that it's referring to like an ecosystem. An ecosystem, it refers to the biotic and the abiotic factors within a given area. Biotic factors would be all the living things, so like the animals, the plants. Okay, the abiotic factors would be all the non-living things, so things like the air, the soil, the water, the nutrients in the soil, things like that. So when you bring those two things together, the living and the non-living, and they're all in one given area, and we're learning about how they all work together to survive, that's an ecosystem. Ecological succession, well, let's break down the word succession. What's succession? Okay, what's a successor? Well, I think about the Queen of England. Who is the successor for the Queen? Well, wouldn't it be her son, right? Which I forget his name. Is it Henry? I don't remember. Anyway, the whole point is she has a successor. So when she dies, her son is going to take over, right? He is her successor. He comes after. So succession has to do with something coming after. So ecological succession is I'm looking at an ecosystem, I'm looking at an area that has plants and animals and abiotic things in it. It has water, has soil, and I want to know, okay, what's going to happen next? What are the steps? How do I create this environment? What happened? Then what happened next? And then what happened next? And then what happened next? And then that's the succession. So that's what we're going to learn is, okay, so what's happening in each step that gives me this ecosystem? Okay. And it's gradual. It's a gradual replacement of one kind of community of organisms by another over time, usually initiated by disturbance. We'll talk about what the disturbances are. And the whole goal is what they call stability. Now, we've heard that before. Remember we did homeostasis? We talked about homeostasis within our bodies. Remember? We talked about how when we reach homeostasis, we're happy. We feel good. How our body's goal is to remain stable. Like, that's the whole goal. That's what it does. It keeps us stable. Well, it's the same thing in the ecosystem. They want to be stable because stability means happiness. So when an ecosystem is stable, all of the animals are happy because they have everything they need. All the plants are happy because they have everything they need. So everybody's happy because everyone is balanced. Everyone has everything that they need to survive. They have shelter, they have food, they have everything. They're stable. So that's the goal. So this succession, this boom, this one thing after another that's happening, this is happening because it wants to reach stability. It wants to reach that goal at the end. Okay, so let's do the first one. We do what's called primary succession. What's primary? First, right? Primary is the first one. Okay, so primary is the first succession. First succession is called first because you're beginning with barren area. No soil, none whatsoever. Okay, so let's think about this. What does a tree need to grow? Besides, we know sunlight, we know water, but doesn't it need soil? Yeah, right? A tree needs soil to run its roots in. Primary succession, there is no soil. We're talking rock, okay? So there's no trees, there's nothing. It's barren. The word barren means nothing. So you look at this picture here. You guys don't know what that is. Volcanic eruption, right? Okay, so what happens? It erupts, lava comes out, right? Okay, and what happens? Lava dries, right? It cools. And what does lava become? Well, what is lava? Isn't lava molten rock? Yeah, it's like really hot rock, right? Okay, so once it cools, it becomes rock. Is there anything on that rock? No, it's barren. It's barren. There's nothing there. Things will start growing there. And when it does, that's that primary succession. So we're talking about land that's like pure land. It's pure, okay? No soil, there's nothing there. It's barren, it's the rock. Another great example of getting barren rock would be like a glacier receding. So we'll talk more about that a little bit later, but when a glacier recedes, well, what's a glacier? A glacier is a bunch of ice, right? Okay, so it's a ton of ice. Sometimes they're floating in the ocean. Sometimes it could just be on land. But the ice that's on land has been there for kaboom years, whatever, okay? Once the ice starts to melt, thanks to global warming, the land that's underneath has never seen sunlight. It's never been exposed to anything because it had a bunch of ice standing on top of it. So now when the ice melts, this land, this untouched land, this barren land is now exposed to the air. So that's another area we see primary succession, is when glaciers recede. And we'll talk more about that later, but that's another place where we'll see barren land because, where we live, there's probably not too much barren land. I mean, because where we live is usually developed. I mean, we live in a neighborhood. There's probably already trees there. So you probably don't see a whole lot of barren land. But that's where barren land kind of comes from. We get to see a lot with volcanic eruptions and with the receding of glaciers. So the goal is to go from this to this. How are you going to do that? Well, it's very slow. It's by weathering activities of tolerant species and then something called pioneer species. We'll talk about that in just a moment. So after those guys move in, those are the first guys that start doing the work. After them, gradually over time, we're going to change to what they call less tolerant species. And then that takes a long time. And then eventually we'll get to equilibrium. Okay, so we're going to go from like nothing to like little plants, and you got like little shrubbies here, and then we get our forest. Well, let's take a look at this diagram and help us walk through it. Okay, so this is primary succession. How do I know? So I need you to remember: primary, first, barren, rock. Whenever you start from rock, it's primary. Whenever you start from rock, it's primary. Rock, primary. Make the connection. Whenever you start from rock, it's primary. So here's my rock. Okay, so what do I know about rock? Okay, well, first of all, rock usually isn't perfectly solid and flat, not in nature. You know how like the sidewalk by your house, like it's supposed to be flat, right? And like even, okay, that's not natural. In the natural world, rock is kind of lumpy bumpy, right? Lumpy bumpy. So what happens? It rains. Where does the water go? In the little crevices. Okay, well, what do we know about water? And when water runs past rock, what tends to happen? You probably already said it, erosion. Okay, so every time the water passes through the little cracks, it kind of takes off a little bit of rock, just a little bit. Like that's how the Grand Canyon was made, right? Water's running through, it takes a little rock, a little rock, a little rock. So eventually it's eroding, it's breaking away the rock a little at a time. What happens when it gets cold? What happens to water when it gets cold? Well, if you've ever, and hopefully you've never done this, and please don't actually do this, but it's a great example. If you take in a can of soda and you stick it in the freezer, your mom probably screams at you, "Don't do that," because the can can explode. Why? What happens? Well, what happens to water when it freezes? It expands, right? So if you take that can of soda and put it in the freezer, it's going to expand. Sometimes it expands so much that it actually pops, which isn't a good thing. That's what I'm saying. Don't do it. But the reason I'm saying is because if some of you have ever done it, you know what I'm talking about. Okay? It expands. Water always does this. So what happens here? What if the water gets in that little crack and it freezes? What is it going to do? What does that do to the rock? It makes a crack. Now it gets warm and the water melts. Oh, but it freezes again, and guess what happens? It cracks again. Oh, and then it melts, right? Because it gets warmer. And then what happens when it freezes again? You get the point? So every time water gets in and it freezes and then it warms up, it's making all these little cracks in that rock. What does that do? It ends up making like little homes for the pioneer species. Now, what's a pioneer? You guys all know what a pioneer is. You learned it in history. You know who the pioneers are. You know who the American pioneers are. They're the ones that first came to the U.S., right? Well, the new land, the new world, whatever they called it back then. First ones there. They're the first ones there, right? Those are the pioneers. Same thing here. There's nobody here now. Who were the first ones there? Lichens and mosses. Lichens and mosses are the first ones. You know why? Because they can handle anything. They're like, you know what? Just give us a piece of rock and we're happy. They can tolerate extreme conditions. Hot, cold, wet, dry. They don't care. They don't care. You give me a piece of rock, I'll live on it. They are not picky. Mosses, a great example of pioneer organisms are like dunes, dune grass, mosses, and lichen. Let me show you what they actually look like because you have seen them. You just probably never called them by name. So here are some dune grasses. We all know what sand looks like. It's not exactly the most inviting place. Think about the conditions of sand. Sand shifts. The wind comes, it moves. So it's not a very stable piece of land to grow on, right? It's very hot because you're openly exposed to the sun, because obviously sand is by the beach, right? So you have lots of sun. So that sun is beating on that sand all the time. And you guys all know, if you've been to the beach, sometimes you put your feet on the sand. Isn't it really hot? Yeah, so that's an extreme environment for a plant. But yet sand dunes can handle. These are examples of different sand dunes. They are primary. They're the first ones there because nothing else can really grow there. You can't get a tree to grow there. The sand shifts too much. How much water does the sand hold? Think about how dry sand is. That's why it's called sand, right? So it's an extreme environment. It has very little water. It's not even stable because it shifts all the time, and it's hot. That's extreme. But sand dunes can help it. Dune grass can tolerate it. They're primary. There are primary species. The first ones that can come in because they can handle this extreme environment. Here's some moss. You guys have all seen moss before. Moss is another one. They're pioneers. Why? Because they can grow anything. A lot of times they grow on the bark of trees. I mean, it's the bark of trees. There really isn't a whole lot, it's not like soil, it's the bark of a tree. They can grow on anything because again, they're very tolerant. That's like an extreme environment. The bark of a tree, they can grow on, they can grow on rocks and things like that. A lot of times you see moss, mostly you see moss on trees, like the barks of trees is where you'll see them a lot. But they can live there. Over here, you can see some moss on, I think this one's on some rocks. Looks like they're on some rocks down in this picture here. But the whole point is they can handle it because they don't have like this high list of things that they need to have to survive. And then here's some lichen. Lichen are really patchy, like flaky looking. You'll see them on rocks, on the sides of trees. Sometimes, they'll live on anything. They don't care. Like I said, they're not picky. They're not picky. Lichens are like, whatever, I'll live wherever you want me to go. They're not picky at all. So those are your primaries, your primary organisms, because they can tolerate anything. So what happens? So let's go back to this picture. Okay, so they come in. We all know plants live and die, right? So these guys come, they live and they die. They live and they die. And as they're doing that, they're slowly breaking away the rock. And when they die, they themselves become the nutrient for the next generation. So they live and they die, they live and they die, they live and they die, they live and they die. You see the rock underneath? You see how high the rocks are here? Do you see how they're gradually going down? Because a little at a time, every time the lichen and the moss are there, again, they break away a little bit of the rock. And when they die, they become a layer for something else to grow. So now over time, look what happens next. Now I get small shrubs, small herbs and shrubs, because now I have a little bit of soil. You see the soil on top versus the rock? I have a little bit of soil. Yeah, a little bit of soil. So I have enough soil for a shrub or an herb to come, because they have a little bit of a root system, but it's not very deep. I mean, it's not like a tree, right? They have a root system, but it's very, very low. It's very, it's minimal. Hence, they can come in. So now they come in. They're the next succession. They're the next step. So now they grow. They live and they die. 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 And as they're living and dying and living and dying and living and dying, they're building the soil. They make layer upon layer upon layer. And as those layers increase and increase, see how much further away they're getting from that rock? Yeah, you see that? So over time, they're building more and more, and it's getting thicker and thicker, the soil. Now, it's called the heat map. These are just again, small plant life. And it's various. These are various species of plants, but they're small. And the same thing happens. These guys are a little bit more complex than these guys. So that's why they come later. They're the next succession. But the same thing happens. They live and they die. 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 Now I get it really nice and thick. Now I can get some taller trees coming in. Notice that they aren't the tallest trees, but I can get some trees in. And eventually I reach my climax, which I have the tallest trees for that given area, depending on where the area is, obviously. For instance, a climax forest in New York is different than the climax forest in, Florida. It all depends on the abiotic systems, the nutrients and the sunlight and the water. All that will determine what your apex looks like. But the point is, it's succession. Each one has to wait. Like these guys cannot come until these guys make that layer of soil thick enough. Then they can come in. These guys got to wait until it's thick enough. Then, you see what I'm saying? Like that's how it goes. Notice that also as I'm going through my succession, the plant life that's there they're less tolerant. They have a specific diet, so to speak. In other words, you're not going to get a redwood forest in Florida. It's not going to happen because redwood trees have specific requirements, a specific amount of sun, specific type of soil, like everything has to be right? And Florida doesn't have that. Hence, we don't have a redwood forest here. Okay? So when you get these plants here, they're very specific. They gotta have boom, 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 boom. So as you go through succession, we're gonna go from plant life that can tolerate anything, they don't care, pioneers. You give me a rock, I'll grow on it. They don't care. Hot, cold, I don't care. I'll live there. That's them. They're like they eat anything. Kind of, you know what I'm saying? Like they're the kid that eat anything. I don't care. We used to have a commercial. He's gonna talk. Mikey will eat it. They're the Mikeys. They'll eat anything. They don't care. But as I go through, they become more and more picky, so to speak, because they're less tolerant. So now they have requirements. I gotta have this. I gotta have that. The soil has to be this thick for me to grow. They get more and more. They get less and less tolerant. More and more requirements to survive. So we mentioned this lichen, and I showed you a picture of lichen. But lichens are really interesting organisms. I mean, you kind of see them everywhere. They're really cool. And what makes them so cool is that they're actually two things. They're algae and fungus growing together. They have what's called a mutualistic relationship. So this is a great picture here. Think about mutual. If we mutually agree to disagree, what does that mean? We both have decided, okay, we are not going to agree on this. Maybe you've heard that. Sometimes they have that in the movies. They talk about, we will mutually disagree. You know, I've seen it in television before. But anyway, the point is that we are both agreeing to something. Okay, we're both like chiming in to make a decision. The algae and fungus have a mutualistic relation because they have both agreed to help each other. Okay, so what's the help? Well, fungus, this particular fungus can't make its own food. It doesn't have chloroplast. It cannot do photosynthesis. Okay, but it can anchor to a rock. Like it has a way of attaching itself to something that's barren. So it can attach itself to a rock, but it can't make any food. And fungus is really good at capturing water. So it can capture water from the air. If it rains, it can hold the water, but it can't make any food. Algae has good chloroplast, but it can't anchor itself. It can't attach to anything. And it has kind of a hard time capturing water. You know, it really isn't, it needs a water source because it can't just grab the water from the air. So we have lichen. So algae is like, listen, I'll make food and I'll share it with you, fungus, if you anchor me and share your water with me. And they're like, hey, that sounds good. Shake the hand, you know? So the algae provides the food, the fungus anchors and captures the water. So the two of them live in a mutualistic situation. So when you're looking at this picture here, let me go back to that picture. Where is it? When you're looking at this lichen, that's what you're seeing. You're seeing the fungus and the algae together. So if you notice the color, it has like a light greenish kind of color. Like it's not green like the trees, like leaves. It's like a light green because it's a mixture. It's not all algae. It's algae and fungus together. Okay, and that, like, you know, that's why it looks the way that it does. And algae does, I mean, you can see here in a picture the variations of algae, the shape of algae, the color. They have varying degrees of color. So there's a lot of variation with lichens. They're a really interesting organism. Okay, so moving on. Oops, here we go. Okay, so I mentioned a little bit again about that pioneer organisms and how soil is produced over hundreds of years. It takes a long time. This does not happen overnight. Okay, so the pioneers will come in, they break apart the rock, they add humus. When they die, remember I told you they die, they live, they die, they live, they're creating what they call humus. And as that happens, they build, I love my little cartoon here, they chomp away, they break down that rock. And as that humus, or the decayed matter of the previous generations, as it increases, it holds more and more and more water. So because it starts to hold more and more water over time, it allows other organisms to be able to come in and grow in the soil that they just produced. So isn't that amazing? Like nature makes its own soil. Pretty cool stuff. All right, so secondary. So that's all primary. I start barren. Remember, primary, rock, barren. Secondary, what does secondary mean? Second. So, okay, if something is second, what does that automatically tell you? If something is second, that means there was something there before you, right? Okay, well, that's what secondary succession is. Now, you guys live in Cali. You all know about the California fires. So this is nothing new to you. There was a forest caught on fire. Now there isn't a forest, and then it comes back. So the second generation that comes in, they're not coming in on rock. The soil's already there. I mean, think about it. Think about the fires that happened in California. All the trees burn, but is there still ground? Yeah, right? They still got soil. And then the trees grow from that. That's secondary succession. What about this? Flooding. We all know what the flood's going to do to this area. It's going to waterlog or kill off those plants, knock down tons of trees. But once the water recedes, once the water's gone, what do we have? Do we go back to barren rock? There's still soil there. And then life comes back. Secondary succession. So, okay, secondary, soil's already there. Primary, no soil, rock. Rock, primary. Secondary, soil. That's the difference. So can you guess? What do you think the growth rate's going to be? Remember we said how in primary succession, it takes like hundreds of years to get to a climax, to get to a forest. It takes like hundreds of years because you're starting from bare rock. What about secondary? You think it takes as long as primary to get to the climax, forest? Well, if you guess the answer is no, you're right. I mean, it still takes time. It's not going to happen overnight. But it ain't going to take no hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. It's rapid. It's very rapid. So the fire's gone. The flood is gone. I jump right up. I'm going to show you a picture in a second. I can get some small shrubs in there, and I quickly make my way to trees. It is going to take years. Don't get me wrong. It's going to take years. But it's not going to be hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. It's not going to, be that extremely long process. It's going to be a lot more rapid, shorter period of times. I can't give you a specific amount of time because it depends on the organism. It depends on the location of the ecosystem. Depends on the level of damage. If it's a flood, how much did it flood? How bad was the flood? How fast was there's so many factors that come into play. So that's why we're not saying a specific amount of time. We're just saying it's shorter. It's just faster than primary. So let's take a look here. Notice, do you see what I see? We're not starting with rock. Secondary. You see that? I'm starting what they call annual weeds. The weeds usually come in first. Why? Well, just like in primary, how we talk about primary, how in the beginning, it's always plant life that doesn't require a lot of stuff, like they're very tolerant, okay? And we went from tolerant plants all the way to less tolerant, same sort of concept. Weeds can grow, they need soil, yes, but they can grow anywhere. If you have a garden, weeds, that's why they call it a weed, because they grow fast and they grow like anywhere. They do need soil, but they grow very quickly. And they're very rapid, and they do require some things, but their requirement isn't as restricted, if I want to use that word, than let's say a tree does. So that's why they tend to be the first ones in once it comes to secondary succession. And then we'll go from that to like grasses, and we'll get some shrubs, and then we'll get like the bigger trees coming in. And again, it does depend on the location that this is happening in. So that the specific location will determine what your first plant life is. I'm just using weeds in this particular situation because we're talking about an oak hickory forest. So it does depend on what type of forest you're talking about. But the key thing is you get these plants that can kind of handle anything, and then you work your way up to least tolerant or plants that require specific things. You get your trees. But what do we got to remember? Primary rock. Primary rock. Secondary soil. The soil's already there, so they don't have to wait. They don't have to wait. The soil's there, so I'm in. All right, so succession of wildlife. So while there is a succession of plants, there's also succession of animals. Let's think about it. Early succession species tend to be, think about what these animals are. Rabbit, quail, think about the size of these animals. Are these big animals? Are they huge? Are they like lions? They're smaller animals. Think about what a lot of them eat. Are a lot of them carnivores? Most of these are most likely like, what are they? Herbivores, right? A lot of them are herbivores. Well, why? Well, in the early stages of succession, what are you going to have a whole lot of? You have a whole lot of plants, but they're very low plants, very small plants. Okay, so you tend to get smaller animals. You tend to get a lot of herbivores because that's all that can be sustained. You got to think about, they have to go protection. If my plant life is very low, it's easier for like a rabbit to kind of hide than it is for, let's say, a deer. You know what I'm saying? So later on, mid-succession, here comes a deer, here comes some moose. I have a little more plant life. My plants are larger in size, so I have area for a home. Because these guys came in first, I now have some food. If I have, well, these guys are actually all, what are these guys? Are these carnivores or are these herbivores? These are actually all herbivores, right? Yeah, they're all herbivores. So I still have some herbivores here. Look here. Ooh, just like I still got some herbivores here. Oh, here comes some carnivores. So again, it all depends on where the forest is. But you can see a lot of the herbivores kind of come in first. And then later on, we get some carnivores, depending on, again, the forest. Notice I'm getting larger in size. When we think about the food web, and we did the food web, we did the different levels of the food web. So you can see how we're starting at the bottom and then working our way up towards the top, getting our top predators later on. Once I'm more established, once my forest has reached more of the climax where I have all these luscious trees, huge trees, I can handle a lot more species there. They can move in. So as there's a succession of plants, there's also a succession of animals. And then think about what that does for the soil. When these guys come in and they're eating up the plants, what are they going to leave behind? Poop and urine, right? And what is that good for? That's some great fertilizer. So these guys also will help in the development of the soil as you continue to move on. So they all kind of contribute to the succession of the ecosystem. Like I said, herbivores on to the carnivores there. But like I said, it does depend on the ecosystem, and where you are will determine what species move in, okay, depending on the location. All right, so what's the end product? If undisturbed, communities will change to a relatively stable stage. They'll be what they call a climax community. Long-term presence, they will stay forever. Dominated by less tolerant species, those are your really big, huge trees like the red forest. They are less tolerant. They are the dominant ones. That's why it's called the red forest. And generally, there's equilibrium. There is balance between the biotic and the abiotic systems that are there. In other words, the wildlife that lives in that system, they're balanced. They keep a check on each other. You got your predators, you got your prey. They are balancing each other. And we did the bust and boom with population dynamics last week. Talked about, how predator and prey, how they always kind of work together. That's the kind of equilibrium you're going to have, where you're going to have that nice balance in a relatively stable stage, this end product, the climax community. So if there isn't a change In the abiotic conditions, generally speaking, you will get the same climax community in secondary succession. So what am I saying? In Cali, where you had those fires, as the secondary succession progresses, you should get back the same trees that you had before. Whatever trees were there, which I'm not quite sure what they were because I don't live in California, but whatever trees burn down, you should get them back eventually. If abiotic conditions don't change. What does that mean? If we don't build a dam and then cut off water supply, if we don't start, cutting down trees, putting pollutants in the soil, if mankind, because we're usually the culprit, if mankind doesn't change the abiotic conditions, if we don't change the water supply, if we don't change the soil content, again, by not polluting or things like that, if we don't get involved, you should get the same forest that you had the first time. It just comes right back. Okay, this one here. Okay, so how can you tell that something is a climax community? Well, a climax community replaces itself with more of itself. Okay, so under sugar maple trees, you will see sugar maple saplings, because if the sugar maple trees are the dominant species in that community, it's going to make more of itself. Again, think about your redwoods. Yeah, there's other plant life there, obviously, but what's the dominant plant life there? The redwoods. So it's mostly the redwoods are taking over. Well, how did that happen? Because, again, the climax community is going to make more of itself. So the dominant species is going to make more and more of itself. So hence you get the redwood forest. In this case, this is a sugar maple tree forest, I assume. Final stage of successions, again, is called climax community. This one is in New York City. We have a lot of oaks there, oak hickory forest or maple beech forest. Climax community in Cali, redwood forest. How do I know what's climax? The key thing, big trees, not shrubs. Shrubs mean that it's in succession. It hasn't ended. When you see big, huge trees, I mean, obviously they don't have to be as big as a redwood, but when you see big trees, that usually indicates that you're in the climax community, okay? So I'll say that again. So if I see shrubs, not climax. If I see small little trees, not climax. When I see the bigger ones, climax. Now, that can be different, and I am going to emphasize that. I wonder if that picture's going to pop up for me. I have an image. In fact, let me show you a quick image of the Mojave Desert, which is in your neck of the woods, just so I can show you a little bit of a difference in climax communities. Okay, so here I'm sharing some beautiful pictures of your neck of the woods. This is the Mojave Desert, which for some of you guys is pretty much in your backyard. Now, when you look at this, you might be thinking, well, Miss O'Green, I don't see any big trees. Well, remember I said it all depends on the abiotic factors where this forest is located or where this community is located. We're talking about a desert. A desert obviously cannot handle a ton of large trees, but it does handle the Joshua tree. And that's what you see there. You see pictures of the Joshua tree. So your Mojave Desert is a climax ecosystem. Like this is the best it's gonna get. This is it. You know what I'm saying? Your desert, this is like the most complex you're gonna get because it is the desert. And the abiotic factors is what determine this. And even if you look at, even with your Joshua trees, you can see how spread out they are. Even look at the little bushes that they have there. They're spread out. So because of, again, the abiotic factors in the Mojave Desert, it's designed this way just because of the nutrients and the way the nutrients work there. So you're not going to see massive, huge trees in the desert, but this is what you're going to see. And so this is the climax community. This is the stable environment for the Mojave Desert. And what you're seeing now is the happy place. The trees have what they need. Those little bushes have what they need. All the living organisms that live there, you know, the scorpions, the snakes, all those guys that live in the Mojave Desert, they're happy. They have what they need to survive. So this is a very stable environment, even though when you look at it, it's not, you know, an exciting looking thing like the redwood forest. It's not as lively, but again, it's a desert. So, you know, you can't expect too much, right? So there you go, guys. All right, so what's gonna happen next? Okay, so well, I'm gonna end this video lesson and there's gonna be a series of videos I need you guys to look at that's gonna add on some visual cues or some visual, help you to visualize, let me use that word, help you to visualize the stages of primary and secondary succession. You also have a virtual field trip, yay, that we're gonna get to go on. And that's all in Canvas. So you will see that when you look down the list in Canvas. So we have concluded this lesson. Let me end off with a little bit of music, because you know, gotta have a little music there, right? And so let me put it back to the beginning here. So like I said, ain't no stopping. There is no stopping plant life. Nature, as people say, nature will live on even through tragic events like volcanic eruptions, forest fires, floods, all that kind of stuff. You know, life lives on. There is no stopping life. It has a plan. It has a plan of how to handle these things. And so how grateful we can be that despite, you know, the ups and downs of life, plant life can live on. So in any case, guys, thank you for watching. See you later. Stay safe. Bye, guys. Here's the Mojave Desert. Bye, guys.